The game gives you a purpose. The real game is to find a purpose. Hey there everyone. Welcome again to Creative Circuit 3.0 for the final session of the day. Here we have with us the guest speaker for the sensation of the youth. Warmly welcome Mr. Bruce Nesmith for the game design session, exclusively for the delegates of Creative Circuit 3.0. Welcome, Bruce, and over to you.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Creative Circuit. I hope you're having a wonderful time with the presentations that you've been seeing and all the things that are to come. And let me just say briefly my sympathies to the political and economic situation in Sri Lanka right now. I know that's a difficult time there, and we have heard all about it throughout the world. So as you may have heard, I am the lead designer for the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, and prior to that I worked for TSR making Dungeons and Dragons products such as the Ravenloft box set and various other games. I've worked on the Fallout video game series, and these days I am a novelist and author. So I'm going to present to you two talks, both of them on different topics. We'll hold all our questions until the end. And without further ado, I'm going to try this right now. It says you cannot start screen share while the other participant is sharing.
I think now you can.
Okay, let's try this again. There we go. That's much better. We'll share this, and I need to share sound. So we will share, and then we will start the slideshow. There we go. Can everybody see that? Okay, so the first talk is going to be on the topic of failing faster. Now, fail faster does not sound like something that you would want to do, but we're going to describe why this is something that's actually highly desirable. So the idea behind failing fast is that you'll succeed sooner. You want to get all of the mistakes and all of the problems out quickly in order to find your path to success. If you try to build everything all at once, all you're going to do is build in your failures, and you will have to go back and recreate everything from scratch, and that's not desirable. So fail faster. Let's talk a minute about that phrase. So failure is a part of learning. Nobody learns without failing, as you can see by this poor, unfortunate kid who is falling off of his bike, but he will eventually learn how to ride and learn how to ride well because he failed. So we need to embrace failure as part of the path of learning. And failure is progress if you learn from it. And that is a big point. You have to learn from the failure. If you just keep repeating the mistakes over and over, if you do not sit back and try to learn why you failed and how you can improve from it, then the failure will not be progress. You must learn. But we have a problem with the word failure. It's a negative word. It seems to give us the impression that we are eternally going to not succeed, that something bad is going to happen. So one of the things we can do is we can change the word failure, because it's not really describing exactly what we want anyway. We want to learn. So here's a very short video from Adam Savage about failing faster.
Failure is a great word to get everyone talking about something other than perfect success from A to B. It's a great word. It catches your attention. It seems
Shocker.
counterintuitive. Right. Yeah, it's got some narrative weight behind it, but it's not what we mean. And I think it's time to culturally move past the fail fast mode, because we never meant that. What we meant was iterate fast. We meant prove this works or doesn't work as quickly as possible. That's an iteration. And when you've proved it doesn't work, well, now you have another step to take. Every other project is going to lead you on all sorts of different paths, and you have to be awake to what the project wants. So there's endless amounts of time when somebody invested a ton of money doing one thing only to achieve something totally different. And that's why we do it.
Yeah.
So I think it benefits us to talk culturally to kids about the fact that, like, yeah, if you're going to build something, get ready to build it 3 times the first time. It's going to take 3 tries just to get it across the line. That's not failure. That doesn't mean 2 failures and 1 success. That means 2 turns that you eliminated before figuring out the pathway to the end.
So what Adam Savage there is talking about is the word iteration. Now, because fail fast has become a catchphrase in our industry, I'm going to continue to alternate between fail fast and iterate in describing this, because iteration may be the ultimate goal and it may be what we really want, but you're going to hear the term fail fast in other places, and it's important to be able to associate it with the right thing. Now, before we talk about life cycle, let me talk a minute about creativity. The name of this conference is Creative Circuit 3.0. It's been said by people far smarter than me that genius is 10% inspiration or creativity and 90% perspiration. That means that you have to do the work, that the creative idea itself is only a small part of making a game, in my case, or making any product really. But I talk about games because that's what my career has been. It's an important part. It's the seed. And without that seed, you cannot grow the product. You can't grow the game or the project. But the real work comes in the perspiration. The real work comes in what you do to make that dream, to make that idea come to life. And there are several life cycles that projects go through, and the life cycle is important to understand in terms of how that relates to fail faster or to iteration, because the life cycle determines what kind of iteration you're going to be doing. So no game is ever born complete. Nobody has ever had an idea for a game that was highly successful and popular, that was released exactly the way it was in the designer's mind. When you look at the games out there that are popular, all of them started off as something completely different than what you saw when you finally got a chance to purchase it and play it. So it starts off as an idea, usually a very flawed idea, but one that has great potential. This is the seed I was talking about before. This is the 10% of the genius. So you have this idea, and it's got the germ of something that is going to become great, but it needs a lot of work to become great. And it goes through a life cycle of development. And this is something that you can either let just happen, in which case you're probably going to have all kinds of problems. It's going to be a very painful process. Or you can control the life cycle, and you can understand what it is and try to manage it so that you get the most out of your time and effort and create the best game that you possibly can. And there are a wide variety of software development life cycle models out there. Agile is particularly popular right now. But not all life cycles are created equal. Not all life cycles allow ideally for iteration. The original life cycle, and the one that is least amenable to what we're talking about, the one that will not allow you to fail fast, will not allow you to iterate well, is pure waterfall. And this is one of the earliest forms of life cycle. and it's the least suitable. And I don't know if those of you in Sri Lanka recognize this picture or not, but this is, and I hope I'm pronouncing it and spell it right, this is Bambarakanda Falls in Sri Lanka, one of the more famous waterfalls in that country. Your game, if it moves through the waterfall cycle, will move from concept to requirements to overall design, detailed design, coding, and testing. And in Waterfall, it cannot move on to the next stage until the one before it is complete. Yet, even though this is something that is flawed, this is something that if we don't think about it, we want to do instinctively. And this is why I'm describing it now, because you need to fight that instinct. You need to say to yourself, no, I don't have to have the overall design completely done before I can move on to the next phase or any of the others that you see in here. If you find a problem in the waterfall design, say something in the detailed design is wrong, you have the risk of having to go all the way back to the concept, because the detailed design issue that you found may actually reflect a problem in the original concept that you didn't bother to take the time to test out and use a different life cycle in order to catch that problem before you went through all the work that came before. And this is the real problem with Waterfall, is that it constantly makes you go way back and redo work that you've already done. Mistakes are inevitable. In the process of making a game, you will make mistakes. And when mistakes are made, they have the potential to waste time and money. So how do we minimize that? What do we do to make sure that we have the least amount of problems and that our mistakes are caught early enough so that we can correct them and then go ahead and make the great game that we had originally envisioned? The evolutionary model and the agile model are the two most popular models currently that allow for good iteration. Agile has some peculiarities that make it a little more difficult to apply in certain circumstances. It's really good for small projects. It does not scale as well to large projects. So I tend to take a step back from Agile and look at the evolutionary. But what I'm about to talk about can really be applied to either one, because I imagine many of you are actually working on smaller projects. I just happen to come from an environment where I worked on very, very large projects. So the basic flow that we talk about, and this picture that I put up here is from more traditional software development rather than games. So the terms they use are a little more formal. You develop your concept, what they call the abstract specification, and then you immediately build a prototype. And you build a prototype of a system. And then you evaluate that prototype. Is it working? Is it what you want? If it's not, you go back and build another prototype. When everything finally is working the way you want it, then you're done. You deliver the system. Now that's highly simplistic. There's some nuances which we'll discuss, but this is the basic idea: is immediately after you get the concept, you want to develop a prototype. And that's what gets you iterating the fastest. That's what gets you finding the mistakes before they become a big problem in your game. If the focus is completely on prototypes, and a prototype doesn't have to be the whole game, it can be pieces of the game. In fact, it's ideal if it's pieces of the game rather than trying to do the whole thing, particularly if you have a large project like the ones I've worked on. And we'll get into more of that later. It's also open-ended, which means that with your prototype system, you can continue to iterate on the prototype over and over and over, and it's finished when you decide it's finished. Because realistically, you can continue to try to polish a prototype forever. And that's one of the risks that this system does have, is that you might never finish unless you have the determination to say, okay, this is good enough. I'm now done. This will be good enough. So let's look at the stages at which you can fail fast or iterate. It starts with the ideas. And this is the safest place to fail, because you can have an idea, iterate on it, and discard it all within 10 minutes. And so you can iterate very quickly, and you can scrub those ideas to make sure that they have a minimal amount of problems. So one of the things that you should do is talk your ideas out with others. Every one of us, when we have this great idea, it gets locked in our minds and we have difficulty seeing the issues that might come up. Other people always come in with other viewpoints. They see your idea from other angles. And so they're able to see things that you might not be able to see. And when they give you those criticisms, defend your ideas, but you must also listen with an open mind. So the idea isn't when somebody says, no, that's not what you should do, that you immediately surrender and do it their way. It's a discussion, it's back and forth. You have an idea, it has merits. They have critiques, those might have merits, and you have to go back and forth, and both parties need to be involved in that. So if someone thinks an idea is not good, it probably isn't, even if you think it's great. But that doesn't mean it's a bad idea. It just means that it may have flaws. So you end up in this situation where you have to be able to listen, and as I said in the earlier point, also able to defend your own ideas. You have to be able to do both of those things. If you do decide to throw out or change an idea, that is the definition of failing faster. That is iteration. And you do have to be willing to completely throw out an idea. It's possible that there is another better idea that you and the people you're talking to may come up with together, or that you may come with on your own, or that they may suggest. And you discuss it, you figure out what is the better idea. And if you throw it out, then you come up with a better idea. Or if you just change it, that's also okay. Either one is failing faster and getting to something that is good, completely. And this is a great quote from Neil Gaiman that I absolutely love. When people tell you something's wrong or doesn't work for them, they are almost always right. When they tell you exactly what they think is wrong and how to fix it, they're almost always wrong. I'm going to make sure to emphasize the word almost here. So Neil Gaiman is not saying that those other people are always correct or that they are always wrong. It's just that frequently people are able to see and spot something that isn't working. They know something's wrong there, but they can't put their finger on it. And so they say what's on the top of their mind, and they think that's what's wrong. And they may not be wrong. So listen very carefully to them when they say something doesn't feel right here, because that gut instinct has probably got something to it, and you need to pay attention to it. But you don't have to fix it the way they say. You have to find a fix for that issue. And that fix may or may not be the thing they suggest. It may be something else altogether. So let me give you an idea of a Skyrim idea fail. So when we were coming up with Skyrim, we had this system called Radiant Story. And Radiant Story was a way for the game to create a story on its own from pieces of actions that the player had done interacting with the rest of the world. So for a small example of Radiant Story would be if the player kills one of the NPCs, the game knew who the NPC's relatives and friends were, and it could pick one and start up a quest that would send that person out to try and attack the player. So the game was being very reactive. And this is a wonderful idea. And we took all kinds of advantage of it in the creation of Skyrim. And one of the things Todd put forward is, what if the entire main quest was a Radiant Story? In other words, what if the entire main quest was reactive to what the player's doing? And this sounds wonderful. And you hear the choir going off and the sunshine coming through the clouds. And then I took this to be something even more specific, which was, let's let the companion's quest line be nothing but Radiant quests. Because we ultimately did decide it would be a bad idea for the main quest to be a Radiant Story. Both of these were terrible ideas, and it didn't take Todd or I long to figure that out. I would say probably an hour's worth of discussion, and we abandoned those. Whereas if Todd had said, I want the main quest to be a Radiant story, and he didn't put that forward for other people to talk about and to critique, we would have started creating that, and we'd have gotten very far down the line before we realized this just wasn't any fun. It wasn't good. And the same thing could be said about the Companion's quest line. So we needed to have that conversation, and we needed to both abandon those positions. And when other people pointed out how bad they were and why, we did abandon them. We let them go, but we used the Radiant story system to enhance the main quest, and we used the Radiant story system to enhance the Companion's quest line. We didn't totally abandon the ideas, but we did take that feedback into account, and we made changes accordingly. So you've got your ideas down. You can also fail faster and iterate on paper. And virtual documents count as paper here. We're talking about documents, not necessarily literal paper, although it can be literal paper if you want. And this is sort of a side note that I like to put down. I work on very large games. Skyrim is an enormous game, and documentation of what you're doing is very important. But documentation is a tool. Remember what it is you're doing. For small projects, document to communicate with other people. You do not need to write down every last little thing that your game is doing. That is spending a tremendous amount of time that you will have to go back and redo. The game's small enough, then the prototype should communicate what it needs to, and you only document small pieces of things that you might not want to forget, ideas for the future, or particular systems whose values you might forget. So this is not to say documentation is not important, but don't let it dominate the design process. You can actually physically make the game out of paper pieces. And I've actually done this for things having to do with games. And that'll be in the next slide, I believe. So if you cut out little pieces of paper and move them around on a pretend screen, as we see here, or just even on a table, that takes far less time than to program and make the art and make your prototype electronically. It's way faster. And you can find problems right away and fix them before you've spent the time to program or make the actual art. When you change the paper design, you are failing faster. You are iterating, and iteration is the name of the game here. On the Elder Scrolls for Oblivion, I actually did this with a paper design. You can see in the upper corner here, we have the persuasion minigame. Now, not everybody here will remember Oblivion, and that's fine. It's an older game, but we had some art that was totally failing to do what we wanted it to do. We had not done the job right for fail faster or iteration. They had actually made the art. And so Todd Howard challenged me to come up with a mini game that used this art that would work better than the existing design. So I literally cut out these paper wedges and I put them on a piece of paper. I put them on a table in front of Todd, and I had a little sand timer. And I made him play my version of the game using these paper pieces and moving them around. And we found a few problems, and we were able to come up with ideas to fix them. And we were able to make something successful without having to change the art, which was the goal of that particular exercise. And that was an example of paper design being used to change a video game. And it would have been much faster, and it was much faster than if I would have gone to the programmers and said, I need you to change it this way. Shown that to Todd, well, that's not working, so we have to go back to programming and get them to change it again, or go back and change the art. So it was definitely a big success and a big win for us in Oblivion. And I have a little video here that I'd like to show about Colleen Macklin and John Sharp talking about iterating with prototypes.
So how do we take an idea like Colleen and I's let's make a video game version of ping pong, and how do we start giving it form? The best way to figure it out is just to dive in and start making prototypes. The faster we get our game out of the pure ether of ideas and into a prototype form, the better off our game's going to be.
The term prototype comes from industrial and product design, where it refers to the creation of a model to represent some aspect of a product's design. In games, a prototype's meant to explore some aspect of the game. What's the primary thing the player gets to do in the game? What's the space they play in look like? How long should the game be? What should it feel like? You can prototype this in a bunch of ways. Usually, if you want to start fast, you want to just make a quick model without getting into writing code right off the bat.
You can draw the game on paper, for example, and use little paper cutouts to demonstrate the moving parts. So here you see Colleen and I making a very quick little paper mock-up prototype of our ping pong inspired video game. We've made a bunch of different paddles, we've drawn a little play space, we made some different balls, and then we're using our fingers to imitate what the game experience might be like. We're changing on the fly the size of the paddles, we're trying out all kinds of different ideas really quickly. Here we're trying out 2 paddles.
You can also use physical objects in your own body to prototype a game experience. Here we're actually playing a version of the game that we thought would be interesting, kind of like a handball version of the game, where we're not opposite each other on the table, but we're actually bouncing the ball off of a backboard. We try more than one ball. What's that feel like? And ultimately try to get at the core of something that's really fun about the ping pong activity and game. We can roll the ball. We can try just different ways to play the game, taking the net off the ping pong table altogether. And what about 2 paddles? How's that feel?
When you have a pretty good sense of how the game's going to work, you can start making digital prototypes. So the first thing we did is we fired up processing. We found some code libraries for basic ping pong style games, and we started playing around with them, getting up something we could play as quickly as possible. May not seem like much, but it was a really important step in our design process to be able to sense and play a real video game version of the game, as primitive as it might seem.
The cool thing about prototyping is that it'll help your ideas get even more developed. So as you're prototyping, you'll be creating and developing your ideas even more. You might even make a discovery that you would have never thought of when you were in the concepting phase. This is the point of the iterative process. Every step along the way, your initial idea evolves, like a single-celled organism to a walking sentient being. You don't need to figure it all out in the beginning. You simply need to be open to the whole process and where it takes you.
That's part of the reason we use design values. They remind us what was important to us in the first place to help us keep on track. We'll go more into the prototyping process in lesson 6. For now, the most important things to keep in mind: make your first prototype as quickly as possible, be open to the process, while always keeping those design values as an anchor to remind you what you set out to do in the first place.
Obviously, we won't be going to session 6. So that was, I think, a really good example of showing different ways to do things with paper, with physical models, and it's much more suitable to the smaller games that many of you may be working with, as opposed to the really large games that I work with. A note here that I meant to say at the top of the presentation: since it's going to be a while before you get to ask questions, if you think of anything you want to ask, please make sure to write it down, because there's going to be 2 different talks, and you run the risk of forgetting your question on the first one once we get into the second talk. So another place to fail or iterate is in formulas. Now, formulas is where I made my living. I'm a systems designer by trade, although I've done all kinds of different design work. And the formulas that are used to underpin a lot of larger games, or even some smaller ones, are my bread and butter. And we simulate formulas in a spreadsheet. And this takes the place of paper design in this case, because the spreadsheet is an ideal tool for playing what-if games and testing boundaries and seeing what happens with various formulas. And the kinds of formulas I'm talking about, the best example might be in Skyrim for the combat formula. The amount of damage compared to the armor that you have, and how that relates to how much health the opponents have or the monsters, and the kinds of damage they might do back to you. But there's all kinds of different spreadsheet formulas that I had to play with. And in order to make this work, you need to use charts and visuals. Just looking at the numbers will only get you so far. The old adage of a picture's worth 1,000 words is absolutely spot on. Those pictures allow you to grasp a concept immediately rather than have to wade your way through a bunch of numbers and try to build the picture in your own head. But don't go too crazy. The spreadsheet is not the game, and it's very easy to fall into that trap. It's one that I've had to dodge a few times, where you feel like the spreadsheet's perfect, so the game should be perfect. But the spreadsheet does not reflect the game. It's a prototype, a lesser copy. But spreadsheets do allow for rapid changes, which is an example of a spreadsheet that I used on Fallout 4. And as you can see along the bottom, there are many different types of, I'm not seeing this, there we go, all kinds of different for disposition, experience points. This happens to be the main damage resistance formula. And as you can see, I lay out the formula with a bunch of different concepts I can change easily. I have my tables where I calculate various situations.